Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. How afraid should we be of a new generation of bioweapons? In 1972, a bunch of major powers came together to sign the Biological Weapons Convention, which came into effect by 1975. And this convention prohibited the possession or use of biological weapons. And it was the direct successor to the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons, though it didn't actually prevent countries from possessing those weapons. And now the Biological Weapons Convention, or BWC, is considered something of a success because while at least one major power, the Soviet Union, is known to have violated that treaty, biological weapons haven't been used to major effect in the last half century. And there is little evidence, even now, that states are actively developing or stockpiling such weapons. So, what is there to worry about? Apparently, there is enough to worry about. There's a recent article in the magazine Foreign Affairs, which makes the argument that synthetic biology could, quote, destabilize the world, and because it can introduce a new generation of bioweapons. And to discuss the merits or lack thereof of this article, I'm joined by my colleague Shambhavi Nayak, who probably understands the Biological Weapons Convention and bioweapons in general better than most people in India. Hi, Doc. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, Aditya, let me just begin with a disclaimer that I don't understand bioweapons. Okay, please don't please don't think that I have some inherent understanding of bioweapons that could be of use.
Yeah, so bioweapons policy. It's like I don't understand nuclear weapons. I only understand nuclear weapons policy. It's a bit like that. All right. Otherwise, we're quite useless. Shambhavi, what you flagged this article to me, and I mean, what exactly are the merits or demerits of the case? Firstly, if you can just tell us what's new about biology and synthetic biology in particular that could actually raise the threats of bioweapons.
Right. So look, there's a lot that has been changing in biology in the past few decades, right? The idea that we can weaponize biology by itself is not new. We went from trying to weaponize germs, actually just throwing germs in wells, right, to weaponizing them using scientific methods. Back in the 1970s, when recombinant DNA was first discovered, there was worry that, hey, we could maybe create polio viruses in labs and infect people. And there were conferences held, there were moratorium on the kind of research that people could do, etc. There are several things that have dramatically changed in addition to biology over the past 40-50 years. One is obviously technology itself has improved. We now have CRISPR and gene editing. Everybody has heard about this. Everyone knows that now we can modulate DNA or RNA the way we want. Now, this we could do in bacteria and microorganisms earlier also. This CRISPR hasn't really dramatically changed the way we can change pathogens by itself, but we now can use CRISPR to understand human biology better, which means that we can now create better pathogens depending on what we understand of human biology. So I think one of the biggest things that have changed is we are understanding both human biology but also agricultural and animal biology better, right? Using these new tools. And once you understand the target better, you can create better weapons. Second, that technologies have become very universally available. Maybe 60 years ago, these technologies were sequestered, traditional strongholds of these technologies, such as the US and the EU, but now the technology has spread everywhere. In fact, one of the reasons why the US was very against the idea that the BWC should have a verification mechanism, which would involve people coming and doing on site inspections and looking at proprietary information, was they felt that there was going to be a lot of disproportionate cost to the US because US was a stronghold of a lot of that information back then, right? And this was in the 1990s, early 2000s. But that is not the case anymore. Several universities, several companies across the world are now investing in understanding more of these tools and using them for peaceful purposes, developing therapies, developing, say, biopesticides, etc. So that the technology by itself, they have become universally available. They have become cheaper. When the Human Genome Project was made, the cost of sequencing a human genome was in billions of dollars. We are now close to doing the same thing in about $100. When we had to first synthesize genome sequences, it used to take days. Now we have benchtop synthesizers, right? So people can actually just buy a piece of equipment, put it in a lab, and be able to create a genome sequence of their liking. That is to an extent very scary when you think about it that way. That if I have a polio virus sequence, I can just make it. But obviously, biology is not that simple. There is more to actually putting together a polio virus, and for it to be able to infect a person. It's not just writing the code, but it is true that you can now do a lot of these things in garages and labs, which traditionally would not have been the case. So there's change in the software, which is the technologies that we can have, like CRISPR. B, there's a tech change in the hardware. We are constantly trying to bring down the cost of these technologies, and simplify the way that they can be done, because these technologies have a lot of good uses that we want the world to equitably use, right? Not just be kept for the rich, but we want everybody to be able to access, say, gene therapies for sickle cell anemia, which means that we are trying to bring down costs for these. At the same time, that obviously brings a risk that if an actor wants to use them for creating a bioweapon, it can happen. Okay. Third, the kind of groups that have been using this, right? So for a long time, technology was with academic labs or with companies. But now with CRISPR, we are seeing biohackers, DIY communities, which are also creating and using some of these components. And that brings a new fear because they are not regulated per se. They're not in a government regulatory framework. I think the biohacker community in the US at least has a pretty serious code of conduct that they apply for themselves. But what happens to other countries? What happens if there's a rogue player? We still don't know. So there are a few things that have changed. The last, I think, is in weapons itself and delivery. So a big question is often you can create a pathogen, but how will you deliver it? And that delivery mechanisms for bioweapons might still be a miss. But now we can, genetically edit insects, and they could carry your bioweapons cargo, and they can go bite somebody or infect a tree or whatever. So a lot is changing on the biology front, creating more potential for weaponization. A lot of this is obviously still in its infant stages. It doesn't mean that tomorrow someone is going to come and create a bioweapon. Even if all of these technologies exist today, the knowledge to use them needs to be in one place, and it is still not easy. I mean, someone who has been in the lab before, and a lot of scientific experiments require to be done thrice for you to show that the result is actually significant, and that's something that everyday scientists struggle with. So creating a bioweapon, as easy as it sounds on paper, and when I talk about it, that all of these technologies are available, it is not really scientifically that simple to just create a bug in a lab. And
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that you mentioned that really caught my attention was verification, right? So verification is a fundamental problem with the Biological Weapons Convention. You have other treaties for chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, where you also have associated civilian industries, but those are very different industries, right? So with civilian nuclear plants, there are verification mechanisms. Firstly, there is a system under the NPT, but also, if somebody's building, for example, centrifuges or something, you can probably tell. It requires a lot of resources. You can probably spot it from space, things like that. With chemical weapons, it's harder to do those things. But because of the way the chemical industry works, and again, the kind of resources and capital outlays that are required, and because there are some fairly clear distinctions between what is of civilian use and what is of military use, and often that's the subject to domestic regulation within countries. It works very differently, right? So biological weapons doesn't, or generally the biotech industry doesn't work like that at all. It's so different. I mean, I was trying to think of an analogy, and I don't think there are any good analogies, but perhaps the one that might come closest is actually cyber weapons in the sense of, you know, because the capital required is so low because it can be done in a garage, because it's so hard to trace and regulate, it might be that difficult to actually verify. So, yes, maybe we might find some verification mechanisms, but I'm assuming that's not going to be the only answer, right? So if it's not verification, what are the other potential solutions that we might have?
right, let me just preface that with one thing. Right, so almost all countries have agreed that there is absolutely no way that we can verify all biological activities that happen in a country. Right, that just it's not going to happen. I mean, you can carry stuff in like a tiny test tube, in your pocket. I mean, how do you even know how? What do you search for? That is just impossible. Also, you don't want to put that burden on any startups or any new industry that is setting up in a country which has never tried this before, right? You want the peaceful purposes of biotechnologies to improve. I mean, for a lot of people, biotechnology is a way forward, right? For sustainable development, we expect it to take over a lot of manufacturing so that manufacturing can become cleaner, etc. So, A, you want to promote biotech, which means you want to have more biotech activities, which just means that verification of the fact that whether a tool is being used for a peaceful or a nefarious purpose is extremely difficult. Having said that, I do want to flag one thing. So, over the past few years, there is this increasing narrative that the next serious bug is going to come in the form of either a bioweapon or some leaked virus or a pathogen because someone was doing an experiment and safety standards were not followed, right? Those are two very different kind of pathways. One comes under biosafety, which I think we need stringent rules for, and perhaps a global minimum standard for what needs to be achieved. Right? The deliberate use of a bioweapon is something that we are seeing more and more in the narratives of the synthetic biology. The article that you referred to, I think Jake Sullivan had flagged this in one of his security reports as well, that gene editing, etc., are going to be creating new bioweapons. While that is true, that there is potential for the use of new weapons, and we have a paper on this, so I cannot now come and say that there is absolutely no way of bioweapons being created. While all of that is true, we also don't need to panic around the spread of these technologies. What we need to ensure is that regulation can balance the need for them to be promoted, because they do have a lot of benefits when used appropriately, and ensure that the risks are minimized. Again, the risks come in two flavors. The biosafety ones should be prioritized, because the Indian government funds most of our work on life science technologies, right? We really don't want pathogens which are being used to create vaccines to escape and cause disease. So that has to be prioritized. And second, then, is what happens for deliberate use, right? Now, the Biological Weapons Convention, as you know, Aditya, is applicable only for state actors, anyways. It's not actually applicable to non state actors. And there's a lot of debate on who owns liability if a non state actor does create bioweapons and uses it for mass destruction. So there's a bit of political ambiguity there that needs to be kind of fleshed out. But let's, yeah, I leave that for another point when I have more information on what happens to, to non-state actors who use this. But what we're basically trying to say is that, can we have more responsibility within our governments to be a ensure that supply chains are strong enough and cannot be disrupted very easily? B, if there is an outbreak, how quickly can we detect and contain it? I mean, finally, we will gauge a bioweapon by the worst that will happen, right? A lot of these things have happened because we have had a COVID-19 pandemic, and people are afraid that if there is a bioweapons attack, could that have similar disastrous consequences, right? But if you can limit it to the extent possible, then that acts as a deterrent itself for people who might try to create bioweapons, and it removes the futility, right? If there's no impact, then there's no need to be really fear. So what we need is resilient health systems, and because those have a lot of externalities, that is applicable as much to a bioweapons attack as to the fact that climate change might bring in new pathogens that we have not seen before, as much to the fact that there's so much human animal conflict right now happening because of mass migrations, which again could be driven by climate change, or instability caused by political regime changes, etc., that are putting humans and animals together, which increases your chances of some zoonotic viruses, etc., coming through. So you basically want to catch all of them as much as possible. And so a resilient health system is probably a better way to go forward. Takshashila had put forward this one idea of a epidemic surveillance center to be able to very quickly grasp unusual outbreaks both domestically and internationally, so that we can limit the impact. And I think trying to do that is in a greater global good than trying to go after each and every person who buys a vial of E. coli from somewhere, right? Because that just is, the
Right.
cost of that is not going to make any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it would seem foolhardy to try and prevent everything, right? If you try and defend everything, you defend nothing. But like you mentioned, basically, risk is a product of probability and impact. And so if you can't manage the probability, you can manage the impact. You can manage it through biosafety and biodefense, essentially, right? I mean, I think those are two things that are just inevitably going to happen. Biosafety, because while not every startup that's tinkering with CRISPR actually needs to follow stringent biosafety protocols because they may not be working on something dangerous, but those that are working on something dangerous should have to, I'm assuming, follow some sort of globally accepted protocols. And then, of course, there's biodefense. There's, like you mentioned, having surveillance and also,
Yeah,
being able to react.
yeah. I was also going to say that the thing with biotechnology is that it is a bunch of technologies, right? It is not one. And so saying we are going to verify everything means, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. So there's things like I spoke about benchtop synthesizers, right? So you can synthesize genomic sequences. You could probably be able to say that let us do a, I hate this term, but KYC for the customer who's buying a benchtop synthesizer, because they could actually have dual uses out of a benchtop synthesizer. There are going to be only X units of people, X units of synthesizer being sold, so you can track the supply chain, and then that's simple. But if you say I want to track everybody who's using CRISPR in India, that's just impossible. So there are bits and pieces that we can do, and that we should be doing. So, for example, whenever someone says sends a gene to be synthesized to any company, they could probably screen and see whether they're trying, whether whoever has ordered for a gene is, has a polio virus slice in it or not, or some toxin slice in it or not. And if it is, then you don't send it. But if it's a harmless, I mean, we have enough information on all of this, right? If it's a harmless piece of gene, then you can. But having those processes are simple enough to be put in and can definitely decrease the risk considerably. So there are things that we can go after. There are processes we can set up. But yeah, trying to go for the moon might. I'm making a space analogy joke with Aditya on the podcast. Um but going for the moon might not be the best way.
Yeah, but going to the moon is a good idea. But anyway, so Shambhavi, I wanted to ask you, I just want to come back to the BWC once more quickly, and then we can just move on to, some things around synthetic biology and what we can do next. So, in December 2022, we had the ninth review conference for the Biological Weapons Convention. And, we've had discussions since then, some of which you're part of. Could you just walk us through what progress has been made? What's the discussion about right
So there have been for a long time an ask for strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention. The convention is extremely underfunded and very small. It has three people in its implementation support unit. The Chemical Weapons Convention, I think, has about 500, and the Nuclear Weapons, I think, has more than 1,000 or something. So we can just see three, and there's one more intern now, I think, who has joined the BWC support unit. So clearly, it cannot be an effective convention if
now?
it doesn't have the funding or the people to actually run it, right? So for the long time, there's been an ask to increase that funding, and asked to put in a science and technology advisory mechanism. So the chemical weapons has one that helps create standards, etc., for verification. Creates means for how verification can work, etc., and keeps up to date on which new technologies come in. So there has been an ask for this science and advisory committee to be put in, which I think is now progressing. I think most state parties have agreed to the idea of having this mechanism. So now they're trying to figure out how this mechanism will be put in and will work. There is a idea for bringing back verification. This was tabled, I think, by Bonnie Jenkins, who was the Undersecretary of State from the US back in 2022, trying to put in a verification mechanism if possible. So I think there is some work on that, and just how we can improve international cooperation and assistance, so that we can actually implement the provisions of the Biological Weapons Convention with better clarity. So that work is, I think, happening. There is progress being made. I think they have till 2027 to come up with recommendations on how all of these structures will come up and interact with each other. So it's exciting times. I think a lot has changed again, because I think technology has spread out so much that this idea that only a few countries might have to burden the cost of compliance has gone down. Plus, I think SARS-CoV-2 was in many ways a wake-up call. Without knowing where it originated from, the fact that there was enough speculation that, hey, was this a lab leak, and the fact that we could not ever do a comprehensive enough investigation, I think, has raised concerns on how we can strengthen more elements of doing that work, right? So there is hope. There is a lot that is happening at the BWC that needs to be watched for the next couple of years. But I again want to come back to that point on um, a lot of this originates because I think a lot of these topics have also come up because of COVID-19. And what we often see in the narrative is also, what if there is another SARS-CoV-2? What if, it's worse? What if more people die? Were we lucky? I mean, you see two extremes, right? We were lucky with this one. It could have been worse, or this is the worst case that can happen. Whenever you see that idea that things would be similar to Black Death or the Spanish flu, etc., there are two things to remember. A disease which has a very high mortality rate, as in it will kill most of the people it infects, will eventually die out. I think this is what we saw with SARS-CoV-1 as well in 2008. That the WHO had called a pandemic, but did not actually progress as much as they thought, and it is likely because the mortality of that disease was much higher. So that automatically presses people to take more stringent containment measures and to follow those measures when they are placed, right? And so high mortality diseases are usually self-limiting. And second, modern medicine is just leaps and bounds ahead of where it was 100 years ago. And again, thanks to the same tools that people are afraid are going to be used for making bioweapons, we have a much better understanding of human biology. We can create drugs better. We can create vaccines better, right? And we can understand an incoming pathogen better and quicker than we have been able to do before. So there's caution that is required, but I don't think there's at this point of time a need to panic on on a bioweapons attack coming. So I am more concerned, for example, with the fact that we have so many war-torn areas right now which are not getting sufficient vaccinations, routine vaccinations, right, for polio, etc. And that leaves those populations vulnerable to those diseases. And if we now get a vaccine-resistant polio in any of those populations, that can very rapidly spread across, and that would be a disaster. So I am genuinely more afraid of those concerns than currently someone using synthetic biology to create a bioweapon.
Yeah, that actually brings me to this idea that synthetic biology may represent an entirely new level of threat, right? I mean, I was also puzzled to see this reference to the Black Death in that article. Does does the reality of synthetic biology means that you can create new pathogens that are absolutely deadlier than anything in the past while also being highly communicable? Is there some sort of super threat that is potentially on the horizon, or is that an overblown idea?
I would like to think that's overblown. I mean, you can think of something that is super deadly, but I would assume common sense would dictate that if it is super deadly, it will limit itself, which is what we have usually seen with diseases, at least in the modern medicine era, right? That there are enough health systems present to be able to put in containment measures. And I think people just are genuinely scared if there's a disease. I mean, you saw Nipah, right? When Nipah came in Kerala in 2018, even in Karnataka, we were looking at the fruits that we were buying because people were scared as the fruit being eaten by the bat, and will I get Nipah because there was a Nipah outbreak in Kerala. And we stopped that, managed to stop that with 17, 18 people, right? And that's your very high mortality kind of a disease, contagious disease that can spread. Um, can a contagion kind of a disease come about? Can someone create that? I mean, look, everything is. I cannot say that there's no way anyone will be able to create that. Can there be a high mortality rate? Yes, there might be. But I think we will be able to shut down systems and recover fairly quickly if that happens. So I'm not overly concerned about this scenario where we're going to wipe out like 50% of Earth's population. I also don't understand why an actor would like to create such a bioweapon, because I mean I understand. So there is a belief that non-state actors might, religious non-state actors might want to do this because they might not be bothered with um, any economic repercussions, etc. Like one thing we learned from COVID-19 is that you can, a global pandemic of that sort will take everybody down, right? If not in terms of mortality, but in economics, in supply chains, etc. right? Everybody, the world over, crashed because of COVID-19. And the idea that someone might want to deliberately do that, I don't think we have yet got the precision of we will attack only certain groups. That might be coming. That for me is a more likely bioweapons attack strategy using synthetic biology, that we tailor the bioweapon to a certain group, either ethnic group or certain
An
individuals.
ethnic
That for me is
weapon.
a more interesting use of synthetic. Yeah, yeah, is a more interesting use of synthetic biology than create a worldwide pandemic. But I don't think scientifically we are there yet, and I'm not sure whether biology will lend itself so simply that you can just create a bioweapon that will attack only a certain set of people but not others. So I genuinely don't know under what circumstances a non-state actor might find themselves incentivized to create and leave a bioweapon sort of a weapon. I think it would be under extreme pressure with no other options. At which point of time, I mean, they really need to have the bioweapon already ready, because I don't think that's the time to start research and development.
It,
And I hope that there's some evolutionary biology learnings there on the kind of things we do to curb others, right? So I don't know. For me, I just find the idea of a bioweapon a little. It is definitely there. We definitely need to do steps to make sure that it doesn't get created. But it is not the most likely. I don't find it the most probable reason for why we will have a next pandemic.
yeah, here's where I'd agree with you. I think that so obviously ethnic weapons, are unlikely to work because ethnic groups are not actually distinct from each other. And even though I'm not a biologist, I'm pretty sure that pathogens cannot attack you based on your religious beliefs or political beliefs. So yeah, I mean that is not going to work. But the fear, Shambhavi, is that some non-state actors have this apocalyptic vision of the future, and those do exist in real life, and we've seen them try to experiment with bioweapons.
Mm-hmm.
So the fears that one of them will basically try to end the world. So, but yeah, I mean that's one of those relatively low probability but very high impact threats that we might be
Yeah.
legitimately worried about. But I completely take your point that uh, the things that we really need to worry about are all the mundane things. It's about poor healthcare. It's about migration. It's about climate change. It's about all of these things and conflict. All of these things bringing new plagues, right? I mean, we have potential new sources of human to animal to human transmission. So you have zoonotic transmission. You have climate change. You have people moving, and all of this is likely to create new risks. Uh, you
Yeah.
know, uh,
I just want to add one thing, Aditya. So I think one of the bigger
yeah.
fears is also that a bioweapon might not look at humans at all, but might try to cripple agriculture, which is again a probable scenario. But now
Yeah.
our food chains, etc., are also so interlaced. I really don't know how that will work.
Yeah,
But again, when it comes to deterrence, I think we have to look at cost. And I think building resilient human health system, agricultural health system, surveillance systems is the way forward. There's a huge opportunity cost for verification. There's a huge opportunity cost for, I mean, that article suggested building enough capacity to vaccinate everybody in 100 days. Huge opportunity cost with building that kind of capacity. Let's invest that in building better public health systems all across the world. And I think we'll just be better off for that.
yeah. It's always seemed to me that if you just prepare a better public health systems, if you actually prepare for the potential effects of environmental degradation and climate change and migration, you're actually more likely to be able to defend yourself from a bioweapon attack, if at all, if it happens, right? Yeah, I would. There's the old idea that plagues and wars are friends and eternal companions of civilization. And while that may be true, bioweapons is essentially the marriage, the unholy marriage of plagues and wars, but it's a marriage that's very unlikely to happen, and most likely, they're just going to be friends. So conflict zones, you might have greater incidences of diseases and so on. So I think we should just understand that and have a more realistic idea of the threat of bioweapons, and we'd be better prepared and be able to use our resources more effectively. Anything else you want to add, Shambhavi, before we wrap up?
No, but I think it is just topical to mention that while we spoke a lot about the Biological Weapons Convention, there are countries which are not signatories to it. There are countries which have been signatories but have been, like you said, like the Soviet Union has been shown to have had biological weapons stockpiles, even though they had signed on to the BWC. And I just think that it is necessary that we are all a bit more responsible. As much as the two of us have now said that the likelihood of a bioweapons attack is low, it is by no means zero. And what we need is more responsible action, which is doable. So we just need to see that come through.
Yeah, wise words. I mean, and I agree that despite the fact that it is a low probability event because of the potential impact, I'm guessing that this is not the last episode of All Things Policy on which we'll be discussing bioweapons. We'll probably be back at this subject again in the near future. But until then, thank you so much, Shambhavi.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.